All right, so hi, we're going to get started. Again, thank you all for joining in person and also via the live stream for our presentation on HIV criminalization in the United States, a call to action. My name is Sean Bland. I'm an associate with the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law, specifically with the Infectious Diseases Initiative. I'm actually a Georgetown Law alum. I got my JD in 2013, and I've been at the O'Neill Institute for just over a year now, where I mostly focus on HIV law and policy issues. Just in terms of the audience here in the room, many of the people are students, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more during the Q&A session about some of the other work that the O'Neill Institute is doing around HIV/AIDS. I think it's important to remember that, at least in terms of the HIV in the U.S., there are about 1.2 million individuals living with HIV, so that's still very much a minority. It's less than 1% of the U.S. population. So it's really important when we start thinking about kind of state advocacy, which Haley will present on at the second half of the presentation portion of today's session, to really think about how not to silo HIV criminalization, so how it how our efforts can align with broader efforts around health and also health law, but also broader social justice advocacy. So both in terms of criminal justice, racial justice, LGBT justice issues. And so learning a little bit more about what the O'Neill Institute does and also some broader work outside of the HIV criminalization space is really important to make our advocacy efforts the most successful. So again, now I'm going to start off the presentation by really just providing an overview of HIV criminal laws here in the U.S. So hopefully I can kind of just start with a general proposition that I hope is very uncontroversial with this audience, but that laws and policies matter. Laws protect people with HIV, they establish norms, and they have been a critical part of the response to HIV here in the United States and throughout the world. And so we need to reframe the conversation about HIV criminal laws really to focus on public health. These laws have been in existence really since the beginning of the HIV epidemic, and are largely informed by stigma and discrimination, but focusing on where we can actually make all of our laws streamlined and actually meant to protect and promote public health really should be our focus. And lawyers have a role in affecting that change. So laws may conflict with public health goals and also can expose conflicting values. And so here are a series of questions that I hope that we will, obviously discuss more in our conversation, but also that we'll start to get some answers to throughout my presentation and also when Haley speaks as well. The first question is, are HIV criminal laws scientifically valid? Valid in terms of the behaviors that are criminalized, are they at all connected to an actual or even substantial risk of HIV transmission? Are the laws themselves actually changing people's behavior as well? So those are key questions to be thinking about, and we'll get some answers from some of the scientific literature that's been, some of the studies that have been done to date. Do HIV criminal laws encourage testing or engagement in care? So are they actually connected to positive public health outcomes? If transmission has occurred, was the behavior intentional? Was it reckless or accidental? What do different laws say in terms of the standard for intent? Can courts readily determine whether disclosure was made? That's going to be, I think, an important point to kind of think about, and particularly with a room full of lawyers, when we think about kind of how do we get at kind of the factual basis for disclosure. In many cases, it's a he said, or he said, she said situation. And when we think about these cases going to a jury trial, for instance, where we're actually thinking about, jurors as the fact finders and the determiner of what the fact is, how do jurors come out? In many cases, as I mentioned, because HIV is only less than 1% of the population is living with HIV, in many cases, the jurors are not going to be themselves people living with HIV. And they'll put themselves, in many cases, in the shoes of the person who is HIV uninfected, and or the person who is on the side of making sure that we have criminal charges brought and possibly a conviction. So they're going to put themselves in that person's shoes, and that in many cases leads to convictions in most of these cases, even where the actual fact of whether disclosure was made or not is up for dispute. Was it safe for the person to disclose their HIV status without risking imminent or future harm? And that kind of goes to kind of the more practical side of these issues. I mean, in many cases, for someone living with HIV, disclosing their HIV status puts them at imminent risk of violence or trauma. And so we need to think about these laws in that context as well. And is responsibility for preventing HIV transmission shared between all consensual partners, or is it solely on the person with HIV? Is it appropriate to demand disclosure of HIV status in all situations? So in terms of HIV criminalization, we use this term to refer to the unjust application of criminal laws to people with HIV based on their HIV status. And in large part, the criminal laws that exist criminalize one of three things. So for the most part, it's going to be criminalizing disclosure. So whether or not the person living with HIV has disclosed his or her HIV status. In some cases, though, laws may be focused less on disclosure and more on actual exposure to HIV or transmission. In terms of HIV criminalization here in the United States, since 2008, we've had more than 260 prosecutions. And so we're having new prosecutions each year. So this is something that we're living with, not just in the past, it's happening every year. More and more convictions and prosecutions are happening. And also we'll get into some of the data in terms of how charges are brought under some of these laws. In many cases, things don't actually get to an actual prosecution. Charges may be dismissed, or as more often than not, there'll be plea deals. So we don't actually get to an actual conviction or prosecution, but the laws have an actual impact in communities. So 32 states and 2 territories have HIV-specific laws, and those are laws that only apply to people living with HIV. Other states, however, use general criminal laws to prosecute people on the basis of HIV status. And by general criminal laws, we think of things such as assault statutes, reckless endangerment, even in some cases, attempted homicide, which is a very kind of baffling kind of use of a statute. If we think about how just current science on HIV, I mean, HIV is not something that, if you have HIV now, you can live obviously a very long and healthy life. It is not anything that comes close to a death sentence, but still we have prosecutors and also jurors deciding that in some cases that it amounts to attempted homicide. And so we'll look at some of those cases as well. But it's also important to note in terms of the difference between HIV-specific laws and using general criminal statutes, a lot of focus has been on kind of repealing and focusing on these HIV-specific laws. But even if those laws were to be removed, there are states that are using general criminal laws to prosecute people living with HIV. So that in of itself, repeal of HIV-specific laws is not going to be sufficient to kind of address the unjust application of criminal laws to people living with HIV. So there's a broader kind of education that we need to be doing. And again, this is important for having this at a law school, and the audience here is that lawyers are the ones who are bringing these cases as prosecutors. They're the ones that are defending these cases, and we need education of all of those people to make sure that these laws don't continue even after legislative or other advocacies to change specifically HIV-specific laws. In 11 states, we have laws that make it a crime for people with HIV to spit or bite. This, even though there's no scientific basis to say that spitting or biting is a route of transmission for HIV. So this is a case where states are going forward and criminalizing behavior that is not at all connected to the scientific evidence. And when you also step back to look at what's the context in which these types of cases are brought, these issues often arise in the context of police arrests. So obviously many of us are acutely aware of community and police interactions, particularly the issue of police brutality. So a lot of these cases come up in an instance in which there's policing of community, many cases vulnerable communities, communities of color, low-income communities, interactions between the police and the individual or individuals within the community escalate, violence, use of force, often unnecessary use of force occurs. In resisting that violence, a person may use whatever tools they have, and that includes spitting and biting, to make sure that they're safe. And it can even get to the point where, if you're someone living with HIV, you might even disclose your HIV status. Say, please do not, do this to me, police officer. I'm someone living with HIV. And that could then be the basis for bringing a charge or under these kind of HIV criminal laws. So it's really important to kind of think about these laws in the broader context in which they're actually being used. And in 33 states, we've had at least one prosecution within the past 2 years. And in 10 of those states, punishment can include registry as a sex offender. So here are just some examples from the Center for HIV Law and Policy, which is one of the leading organizations kind of working on HIV criminalization here in the US, documenting some of the specific instances in which these laws have been invoked and kind of the result. So in New York, a man was sentenced to 10 years for aggravated assault after biting a police officer. In Iowa, a man with HIV who had an undetectable viral load, so that's a person who's on antiretroviral medications and is using them as prescribed, and essentially has his HIV infection fully controlled. It's virally suppressed, and we'll get into some of the research on kind of the public health implications of being virally suppressed. But essentially, it means that your risk of transmitting the virus is near zero. And even in that situation, this man was sentenced to 25 years after just one sexual encounter in which a condom was used. A man with HIV in Texas was serving 35 years for spitting at a police officer. Obviously, these laws affect people of all demographics. So, I mean, younger people, students. A 19-year-old student was charged with intentional HIV exposure after a consensual sexual encounter with another student. And a 23-year-old man in Oregon was sentenced to 87 months in prison after pleading to unprotected sex without disclosure of his HIV positive status to someone that he met online. So I want to just give you some background on the National HIV/AIDS Strategy. Was a strategy that was released by the Obama administration in 2010. It was a 5-year plan to really guide the nation's efforts around addressing the HIV epidemic in the United States. And it really was meant to kind of align the efforts of public and private stakeholders around a set of core indicators for HIV. And that strategy was recently updated last year in 2015 to guide the efforts up through 2010 for the next 5-year period. And the HIV/AIDS strategy has very specific language with respect to how we should be thinking about HIV criminal laws. It says to be free of discrimination on the basis of HIV status is both a human and a civil right. Laws and policies should reflect current public health best practices for preventing and also treating HIV. HIV-specific laws do not influence the behavior of people living with HIV in those states where those laws exist. And one of the reasons for that is that in many cases, people aren't aware of the HIV criminal laws in their state. And in many instances, the existence and enforcement of those laws run counter to scientific evidence about the roots of HIV transmission and effective measures of HIV prevention, and they undermine public health goals for promoting HIV screening and treatment. And so in terms of recommendations from the National HIV Strategy, it's very clear that state legislatures should review their HIV-specific criminal statutes to ensure that they're consistent with current scientific knowledge on HIV transmission, and that they support public health approaches to preventing and treating HIV. In terms of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so it's the nation's leading public health agency and the main agency for HIV prevention. The CDC has released estimates on HIV transmission risk. And so if we just look through this is risk per 10,000 exposures. So it divides it into types of exposure. The greatest kind of likelihood of transmission happens with something like blood-to-blood contact, so a blood transfusion. In that case, 9,250. The risk of transmission is that out of 10,000. So it's almost guaranteed that if you have a blood transfusion for someone who has blood that's HIV infected, that there will be transmission. But when we start looking at some of these other categories, the risks are substantially less. So in terms of sexual risk, when we think about sexual risk, the highest in terms of route of transmission, the highest risk route of transmission is receptive anal sex, so being the receiving partner for anal sex. In that case, the risk is 138 per 10,000 exposures. So that's just about 1%. And so whether that constitutes a substantial or significant risk for transmission is something that, would be an issue, a fact that would be would be at issue at a trial, or if there was actual charges under a criminal statute. But again, this risk chance doesn't include kind of all of the methods of HIV prevention that exist out there. obviously, for many of us, many people think of condoms, obviously, as being one of the first kind of prevention modalities or strategies, which are highly effective at reducing the risk of HIV transmission. Once you add in condoms, that 1% chance is significantly lower. We also add in, as I mentioned, having an undetectable viral load, so being virally suppressed. We have research that's come out over the last 5 years, really, starting with HIV Prevention Trials Network 152, so HPTN 052, was a study that was released. We had the results in 2011, in which we found that kind of early treatment for people living with HIV substantially reduces the risk of transmission by 96%. So that's 96% reduction just by getting on antiretroviral therapy as soon as you get your HIV diagnosis. A follow-up to that study was released earlier this year, looking at specifically those individuals who were HIV positive and received treatment and actually achieved viral suppression. In that case, there was no transmission of HIV between kind of partners, one of whom was HIV positive and the other partner was HIV negative, when they'd achieved viral suppression. And the HPTN 052 study was done predominantly with opposite-sex couples, so heterosexuals. This year, at the International AIDS Conference that took place in Durban, South Africa over the summer, we got some data from the partner study, which was done also with opposite-sex couples, but also had a sizable number of same-sex couples. So obviously, as you know from this slide, being receptive anal sex, which is probably more likely in gay couples, not that heterosexual couples are not also engaging in it, but that we didn't have the data really to kind of say what risk looked like with the population of gay couples. And from that study, we found similar results. When individuals were on suppressive antiretroviral therapy, there were no transmission between an HIV positive partner to his or her HIV uninfected partner. So then, once we look beyond kind of receptive anal sex, the numbers get even lower. So we see 11, the risk is 11 per 10,000 exposures. So that's approximately 0.1%. So those are very low chances, even with some of the risk behaviors that we think of as being kind of very high risk, I think, in just general parlance. And it goes down further when you think about penile vaginal sex, so between opposite sex couples. And then we start thinking about very minimal to no risk for oral sex. And then some of the, again, although they're the basis for convictions under these statutes in a variety of states, the CDC lists the actual risk as being very negligible. I mean, it's very hard to kind of eliminate risk altogether, and scientists don't very often get to the point where there's no risk and they are so confident in that, but the CDC's estimates don't even list a number. It's so low that they don't even list a number. And so the risk associated with persons with HIV, not on treatment here and not on condoms, when we add those other prevention modalities in there, it's even lower. So what does the Justice Department say? The Justice Department collaborated with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2014, and they actually published an article in a peer-reviewed publication, HIV publication, AIDS and Behavior, on the prevalence and also the public health implications of state laws that criminalize HIV. And on the basis of that, they then, a few months later, issued best practice guidance for states to modernize their HIV criminal laws and also to set forth the current science on HIV transmission. And a part of those best practices is for states to eliminate HIV-specific criminal penalties in all instances except for two very distinct circumstances. One of those is when a person who has HIV commits a non-HIV specific sex crime where there is a risk of transmission. And so crimes such as rape or sexual assault. The other instance is where an individual who has HIV and there's evidence that clearly demonstrates that that individual's intent was to transmit the virus and that the behavior engaged in had a significant risk of transmission. And so we'll look at that standard in terms of some of the specific cases that we'll be discussing later on in the presentation. And so, again, what research says about the impact of these laws, there's no evidence that HIV criminal laws deter risky behavior. There's no difference in sexual risk-taking in states with and without these criminal laws. So they're still having the same types of, there's no deterrent effect. There's no public health kind of benefit in that case in terms of changing sexual risk behavior. People are generally unaware of how these laws function. Again, most people don't even know that the laws exist. They send an inaccurate message that avoiding sexual partners with HIV is an adequate prevention strategy. We already know what the prevention strategies are. We've named several of them: condoms, making sure that all people living with HIV are, diagnosed, they're connected to care, they're virally suppressed, because then we get to near zero chance of transmission. Things like pre-exposure prophylaxis as well. So pre-exposure prophylaxis is the use of essentially antiretroviral medications that people with HIV use. It's the same medication minus one drug, but it's used amongst people who don't have HIV, who might be at risk for HIV. And taking a pill every single day has been shown to substantially reduce the risk of HIV transmission. And so we have studies, that have been done in a variety of different populations, and have shown high efficacy. And most recently, we've had a kind of within a clinical setting, a real-world clinical setting, data from Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco, where last year this study came out. They followed, over the course of a study, I think about 657 individuals who were on PrEP at their facility over a 2.5-year period, and none of those individuals who were using PrEP became HIV infected over the course of the study. So it's a highly effective prevention modality. Also, effective treatment reduces, as I mentioned, HIV transmission risk to near zero. And studies have shown also that an association between these HIV criminal laws and increased stigma, and that this stigma also is associated with with reduced health outcomes. So now I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of two studies that have been done on how HIV criminal laws are actually enforced. There haven't been too many studies, and hopefully there will be more in this vein. There are no federal laws that require the reporting of how these laws are used. We have laws like that for homicide, for instance, but we don't have similar laws where all states have to report when these laws are actually invoked. And in many cases, even when the laws are used, the data that we do have is based on actual convictions. And as I mentioned, many of these cases don't actually result in convictions. They will either result, for instance, in a plea deal, or in some cases the charges will be dismissed. So when we have a context where overcharging is very likely and plea deals are often kind of the norm, we can't just look at convictions alone. And so the studies up until this point, up until these two studies, were largely based on pretty much what you could find in this, like the media, kind of just Google searching, figuring out when laws were reported through kind of local and other kind of newspapers and publications. This study took a different approach, and the first one, based on Tennessee, it's comprehensive data on all those charged with, will charge under either their HIV exposure statute or their their aggravated prostitution statute, which is essentially solicitation by someone who knows that he or she has HIV. And so they were looking in the Nashville area, and they based all of the data on arrest records. So again, not looking at just convictions, but arrest records, case summaries, and also affidavits of complaint. So if cases were dismissed, we'd still be able to capture those. And they looked at all of the charges that were brought in the Nashville metro area over an 11-year period from 2000 to 2010. And the other study that we'll look at briefly is in California, data from the Williams Institute on the enforcement of criminal laws statewide in California. So Tennessee has one statute. It's a criminal exposure to HIV statute. Makes it a felony for a person who knows that he or she has HIV to engage in intimate contact with another person. And intimate contact is broadly defined as the exposure of the body of one person to the bodily fluids of another in any manner that presents a significant risk of HIV transmission. The statute doesn't define intimate risk and is actually silent on condoms. And so similarly, it's silent on things like pre-exposure prophylaxis and treatment as prevention. And the statute doesn't specifically require an intent to transmit or actual HIV transmission. To lawfully engage in intimate contact, a person who knows that he or she has HIV must disclose his or her status to their partner and then receive consent in advance of intimate contact. And the other statute that's relevant here in Tennessee is their aggravated prostitution statute, which makes it a felony for a person who knows that he or she has HIV to engage in, quote, sexual activity as a business, or is an inmate in a house of prostitution or loiters in a public space for the purpose of hiring to engage in sexual activity. So again, if you are HIV positive and you're engaged in any act of solicitation, you can have charges brought as aggravated prostitution, which is a felony charge. And so for both violating the HIV exposure statute and the aggravated prostitution statute, we have very high, felony level punishment, so 3 to 15 years of imprisonment, fines up to $10,000, and also classification as a violent sexual offender for a minimum of 10 years. And it's important to, again, note that these laws were largely passed before we had a lot of the latest science. But in terms of Tennessee, they're being labeled as a violent sexual offender. That was a change, at least under the aggravated prostitution statute prior to July of 2011. You would be labeled as a sex offender, but not a violent sexual offender. And this was a change that was made in 2011. So these laws are being revisited, they're being retooled, even in the present. And so we need to be aware of that as well when we're thinking about our advocacy strategies. So just giving you some of the data, we had 25 people who were charged with HIV exposure over that 11-year period. There were 27 charges in total. 2 people were charged twice. 1/3 of the charges were dismissed. In the demographics, we'll see that these laws were disproportionately applied to men, so 74% of those charged were male. 56% were white and 44% were black. That's an overrepresentation of black individuals. So if you look at Nashville, it's about 28% black, and yet under these statutes, 44% of those were charged. The ages of those who were charged ranged from 23 to 56, with a median of 36 years. And this was a very socioeconomically disadvantaged population. So I think that'll be something that we'll come back to, and we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about our strategies, that these laws disproportionately are used to target the most vulnerable people in society. So 2/3 relied on a public defender, and 3 of these individuals out of 25 were homeless. Of the complaining witnesses, the majority of them were male. And so now when we look at the actual specific charges, about 40% of the charges were for scratching, biting, or flinging blood, and usually that involved a police officer or a hospital emergency staff. And so again, keeping this in kind of understanding that how these charges actually come up in real life, 40% of the time, this is with resisting arrest, essentially. 16 out of 27 charges, or about 60%, involve sexual activity. So again, it's important to note that although sexual activity is the majority here, that a large percentage are not probably what you would initially think of when you're thinking about HIV criminal laws. And we need to have strategies that are relevant for both cases. In terms of sexual activity, most of those cases involved opposite sex partners. 60% of the charges resulted in conviction, 9 for HIV exposure, and then 7 for lesser charges. So again, things like reckless endangerment and assault. And the sentences ranged, so it could be as little, in this case, as 1 month, but also up to 8 years. And remembering that this also resulted in mandatory registration as a sex offender. So there are 23 persons who were charged with aggravated prostitution over this 11-year period in the Nashville area. And you'll see the difference in terms of demographic, that in the case of the aggravated prostitution statute, overwhelmingly impacts women. So 68% are female, and it's split pretty evenly between white and black, even though, again, blacks represent about 28% of the population in Nashville. The ages ranged as well, and this was an even more socially economically disadvantaged population. So 80% had a public defender, and 30% were homeless. And so we didn't have the authors did not have sexual activity information for all of the cases, but of the 17 that had that information, we see that 13 of the cases involve solicitation for oral sex. So again, that's where, looking back at the CDC estimates, really minimal to no risk of HIV transmission, and yet these laws are still being mostly used in that case. Three cases involved vaginal sex, and 1 case involved anal sex, and we did know from the actual arrest record that a condom was used. 56% of those charged were charged after solicitation of an undercover police officer. And that's a really important fact to think about, like how these cases, again, come about. This is These are sting operations where police officers are targeting people who are suspected of being sex workers, and in that context, when they find out, or if they know in some cases from prior conviction or prior arrest records that that person's living with HIV, these statutes are then evoked. And we contrast this with the HIV exposure statute, almost always resulted in conviction. So 92% of the time. 9 times out of the 17 were for aggravated prostitution, and then 9 times out of the 25 charges were for aggravated prostitution, but then about the majority of the time it was for a lesser charge, such as misdemeanor prostitution. All right. The good thing, and Haley will talk a little bit more about it, is that Tennessee is organizing. We're seeing efforts across the country to organize. The Tennessee Working Group is reviewing and refining 2 alternative drafts of a bill to introduced in 2017 to their legislature in consultation with their health department. And advocates have been involved in ongoing outreach and education for some time, and they're going to work on really having a targeted plan to continue outreach and education, both to policymakers, but also, again, to lawyers, to prosecutors, as well as to defenders, to other legislators, and also to community members as well. Finally, just briefly, HIV criminalization in California. We have 4 HIV-specific criminal statutes in California and 1 non-specific statute that criminalizes exposure to any communicable disease. Over a larger period of time, so about a 16-year period, we had 800 people come in contact with law enforcement based on these laws in about 1,200 different instances. And in California, and I don't think it's sizably different in most other jurisdictions, but in California, we know that these laws are specifically affecting sex workers. So 95% of all HIV-specific criminal incidents involve people engaged in sex work or suspected of engaging in sex work. And again, although these laws peaked in terms of the number of people affected in 2000, they're still being invoked today. And so the most recent year was in 2013. In terms of the demographics, where you live matters. These laws are mostly affecting people in Los Angeles. So even though 37% of people living with HIV in California are in Los Angeles, 57% of the time that these HIV criminal statutes are used, they occur in Los Angeles County. They disproportionately affect women, and they also disproportionately affect people of color, particularly Blacks and Latinos. In about a third of the cases, these charges incidents result in charges, but we also see cases where they result in charges under the non-HIV specific statutes, and or there are many cases where no charges are brought at all. And again, just some data from the Williams Institute is that white men were significantly more likely to be released and not charged. So again, thinking about how these laws are applied and kind of looking at kind of racial disparities and also understanding this through a kind of social justice perspective is important. We'll look at some of the other kind of efforts that are going on, state advocacy, but some of the proposals in California have been to repeal various sections of, again, there are 5 laws that are at stake, repealing, making it a felony for a person with HIV to donate blood and other, bodily organs, tissue, semen, things like that. Why? Because the FDA already requires that all of those fluids be tested for HIV, so this law serves no purpose. Also, repealing, making it a felony for people with HIV to engage in unprotected sex with a specific intent of infecting a partner if no disclosure occurs, because that law specifically singles out HIV from other communicable diseases. Also, repealing a section that makes it a felony for a person who's charged with solicitation to have been previously charged with solicitation in the past. So again, like what's at issue here is if you have been charged in the past with solicitation and then you have another charge, there'll be higher penalties for you if you're living with HIV. And again, also other additional penalties for people who are living with HIV and engaged in solicitation or sex work. The current law also makes it a misdemeanor to willfully expose another to any communicable disease. Advocates have supported streamlining this law and have proposed amending it to really make it clear the specific cases which we might think of, actually invoking it. And so these are the 5 points that some advocates have proposed. We can kind of think through them and come back to them in our discussion. But specifically, there needs to be knowledge of HIV infection for the person living with HIV. There must be specific intent to transmit the disease to another person, intentionally engage in conduct that exposes substantial risk of transmission to another person. The other person must not know of the other individual's HIV infection, and transmission would be acquired in addition to exposure. So this is kind of moving in a direction of kind of a law that might pass a little bit more of kind of a muster to kind of a legal eye, but we can kind of discuss that a little bit more after this. All right, and that's my introduction, and I'll pass it over to Haley.
Hi, everybody. My name is Haley Shear. I am an extern at UNAIDS here in the Washington, D.C. office. I am also an LLM student here at Georgetown Law in the Global Health Law and International Institutions program. So Sean just got finished discussing what HIV criminalization is in the United States and some specific studies that have been implemented in order to try to understand these laws a little bit better and the effects that they have on them. And I'm also going, with what Sean just said, I'm going to talk about the practical effects as well, that not only affect individuals living with HIV, but the population as a whole. And just as Sean said, there are at least 30, I believe there's 32 states plus the federal military have HIV-specific criminal laws as of today. And we will look, as far as practical effects go, at specific cases such as those as Michael Johnson from Missouri, and looking from a broader perspective as well, how these laws affect the population of individuals living with HIV. Essentially, there's a lack of progression, and there's still a significant stigma attached to HIV in today's society, despite modern science and medicinal advancements. And essentially, HIV-specific statutes are a vicious circle, and that they inhibit growth of understanding HIV, and they bring us back to that era of hysteria in the 1980s and 1990s in which these laws were made. And so I think this is a really good snapshot and overview. Can I walk away from this mic? Okay. A good snapshot and overview of the United States related to HIV criminalization. And I know y'all can't see the specific writing, but that's okay. I want to highlight that these red states have an HIV-specific statute that has been used at least one time in the past 2 years, which you can see that's a large number of the states. And then the orange states as well don't necessarily have HIV-specific statutes, but they use more generalized criminal laws such as intent to transmit or expose a non-communicable disease, for example. And in those orange states, those types of statutes have been used in HIV-related prosecutions as well. And I'll go into more detail on specific cases. And then the little caution signs indicate states that have laws that require that if you're convicted of an HIV-specific statute, that you're required to register as a sex offender. And Sean kind of mentioned that as well, whether it's violent or non-violent. Either way, it's a sex offender list that you have to be on. And this is current, so, well, yes, that was in July 2015, so that's current. So to get a little more specific and provide a good overview of the practical effects of how these laws are utilized, we'll look first at Missouri, which is very topical and relevant, which I'll explain here in a second. But first I want to look at the law itself. Essentially, it's an HIV-specific statute, and it says failure to disclose your HIV status to your partner can mean a Class B felony. And the sentencing range for this sort of felony conviction is 15 to 30 years imprisonment. There is no affirmative defense of use of protection. There is an affirmative defense if proof of disclosure before intimate contact is proven. However, if you think about that, that's the defendant's burden to prove that in a court of law, in a jury trial, for a statute that already has a significant stigma attached to it. Juries are not going to like that, and it's very difficult to prove an affirmative defense such as disclosure before intimate contact, because it ultimately comes down to a he said, she said type of scenario. And it has been proven to be very difficult to show that sort of context in jury trials. And then I also want to point out the culpability for this statute, which is recklessness. Now, recklessness is a conscious disregard for a substantial and unjustifiable risk in the certain context. And it's a step down from intent, and it's very important for the prosecution, as most of us here in this room as lawyers know, to prove the culpability element of this case. And so you don't necessarily need to prove intent in this law, just that there was a conscious disregard for that. So who is Michael Johnson? Michael Johnson is a young gay black man from the St. Louis area who is currently serving 30 years for this failure to disclose law. And this case has grabbed a lot of attention, not only because of the significant sentencing time period, which for a young man, 30 years can be well over half your life. But it has grabbed the attention of not just HIV criminalization civil advocacy groups, but it's also grabbed the attention of LGBT groups, racial injustice groups, lots of different social injustice groups that are coming together to work on his appeal. So kind of speaking to what Sean said, HIV criminalization doesn't just touch on individuals living with HIV. It touches on all kinds of social injustices, whether that be race, socioeconomic status, gender, you name it. It touches a lot more than people realize. And so this case is significant because Michael Johnson, his appeal is being worked on right now by various groups, including state and national groups. And they filed an amicus brief on his behalf, and it is under review right now. So the outcome of his case is to be determined, but he is still sitting in jail, and I think he was convicted sometime in 2014, 2015. So another question that I had while I was doing my research is, why are these laws the way they are, and why are they utilized the way they are? Because as most of us know, even as educated professionals, HIV is no longer this death sentence that it used to be considered. Advancement of scientific and modern medicine has shown that risk of transmission is very low, and people can live a relatively normal life even living with HIV. It's not as big of a problem as it used to be with our modern medicine. And I spoke a lot with various state advocacy group leaders throughout my research, and these are the three things that I repeatedly heard from these state leaders. One is lack of education, and this isn't just to the layman or the public, it's to prosecutors, it's to judges, because they're the ones who will ultimately hold the power behind these HIV criminalization statutes. And there's a misalignment with the law that these laws were created at a time where not near as much was known about HIV as it is today. And by having these laws on the books, it perpetuates this ignorance that this HIV is something that is it could be horrible if it exposed or transmitted. And so there's just a general ignorance, and there's a lot of prosecutorial discretion and judicial discretion when it comes to sentencing. The second biggest issue that I found is the utilization of mental culpability or lack thereof. In my research, a lot of prosecutors tend to disregard mental culpability or don't necessarily meet the threshold beyond a reasonable doubt to convict individuals of these HIV-related or HIV-specific statutes. And finally, and I'll talk more in detail about this as well, is minimal post-conviction relief. Specifically, plea deals are a huge hurdle to HIV criminalization. And it really is a barrier to those who are convicted and or incarcerated to find justice in our justice system. But change is happening. As Sean mentioned, we have 2 states who have reformed or repealed their state laws. And then we have Ohio, who has recently challenged the constitutionality of their statute as well. So we can start with Iowa, because they were the first state to reform their state statutes. So their prior law was very harsh. Essentially, if you were HIV positive, it was illegal to engage in intimate contact. And I say this because, as you can see below, there was no mens rea requirement. So no mental culpability required. And it was a Class B felony with up to a 25-year sentence. There was no affirmative defense to this statute. And if you were convicted, you had to register as a sex offender. So what happened? State civil advocacy group movement happened. CHAIN, which their, I can't remember their specific, the Community HIV Hepatitis Advocates of Iowa Network got together and started mobilizing movements and efforts in order to change these draconian laws. And then they also recruited the help of the Zero Project, which was nationally based an HIV advocacy group movement as well. And they recruited legislative help as well. And it took a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of effort. It took them 5 years in order to get this legislation changed. But they eventually introduced a bill into the legislation that was unanimously approved to reform these laws. And so now there is a hierarchy of mental culpability required for various HIV-specific laws. For example, there is a statute that is a Class B felony if you intend to transmit or expose another to HIV. And then it is a Class D felony if they can prove a reckless disregard, which was a conscious disregard for a substantial and unjustifiable risk in the context. So we still have a Class B felony, which requires has a 25-year sentence associated with it. But now we have this hierarchy where, like a Class D felony, for example, only has a sentencing maximum of 5 years with a $7,500 fine. Additionally, we have an affirmative defense of disclosure or use of protection available. But as I mentioned before, that can be proven difficult, which is why I would say Iowa went from bad to okay-ish, because affirmative defenses are hard to prove, and it's been shown in courts that juries tend not to like affirmative defenses because it turns out to be a he said, or he said, she said type of scenario. And this reformation still presents significant time to be served if you're convicted under one of these statutes. So yes, there's a mental culpability hierarchy, but you can still serve anywhere from 1 to 25 years depending on the statute that you're convicted of. And this just perpetuates the stigma even more by simply having these sort of laws. And I think Iowa is a good illustration of this, in that it takes baby steps. And at least for Iowa's case, Iowa had extremely strict, almost basically strict liability laws and now they at least have this hierarchy where people can at least have a chance to provide a defense or have a certain mental culpability threshold to meet. And moving on to Colorado. Colorado recently repealed their statutes several months ago. So this is a fairly recent event. Their prior law, they did not have an HIV-specific statute. So as I mentioned before, these more general, broad statutes that were used against individuals living with HIV. For example, one of their laws allowed for an aggravating sentence enhancement up to 3 times for an HIV status. So for example, if you were convicted of like a sexual assault, for example, and you were HIV positive, the judge could look at your HIV status and give you the maximum sentence 3 times that. Additionally, in Colorado, sex workers were targeted. There was a specific statute that allowed, if you were suspected of being a sex worker, they were allowed to test you for HIV, and if you tested positive, the prosecutors could have complete access to your medical records, which is not only a serious invasion of privacy, but also extremely stigmatizing in so many aspects. And so Colorado is a perfect example of how more general, broad criminal statutes can be used against individuals living with HIV. So what happened? We have our state civil advocacy groups. The Colorado Mod Squad, along with CORA, a couple different state advocacy group movements, recruited the support of Senator Pat Stedman, and they worked for several years to mobilize their efforts. And eventually, Senator Stedman submitted Senate Bill 146 to the legislature, which effectively repealed these 2 specific statutes that were being used against individuals living with HIV or people who were prosecuted under these statutes and who had HIV. It should be noted as well that Senator Stedman, she was just talking at the HIV is Not a Crime conference in Huntsville, Alabama recently, and stated that these crimes were not really utilized that much, and that the prosecution didn't see that many convictions result out of these statutes. And for me, at least, when I read that, I thought, okay, well then why are they looking to change these laws? You know, if they're not really being used, but at the same time, it's kind of the same argument as, you know, why not let these sleeping laws lie? And it speaks to the issue of how we view HIV and how even if, you know, these laws aren't being used for convictions, they're nonetheless still being utilized as threats to vulnerable societies in our more vulnerable populations in our society. And so I thought that was an important highlight to note, is that yes, some of these statutes might not be utilized for convictions, but they're still there, and they still perpetuate the stigma and threat to individuals living with HIV, as well as other social groups that are vulnerable. So kind of moving forward, so we looked at some legislative changes, but that might not be the only option. So just recently, the Ohio Supreme Court granted review of Orlando Batista's case just a couple weeks ago on the basis of its constitutionality of the statute. So Orlando Batista, he was convicted of an HIV-specific statute, kind of similar to the Missouri one. And he's currently serving an 8-year prison sentence. He went to trial, he was convicted, and his lawyers appealed. And on appeal, his lawyers argue that the statute violates the Equal Protection Clause of the state and federal constitution, the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment on the state and federal constitution, and it violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is really a huge moment, not only just for Ohio, but for other states who have HIV-specific statutes as well, because this is really the first time that a state court has reviewed the constitutionality of this statute. And I'm sorry. So depending on what happens here, there could be significant effects across other states as well. So for example, if the Ohio Supreme Court does state that this statute is unconstitutional, even on a state basis, this could have effects to other states who have HIV-specific laws that are similar to the Ohio statute as well, meaning, if one state deems it unconstitutional, you get the movement going that maybe these other statutes are unconstitutional as well, which also it has that ripple effect, especially for the federal U.S. Constitution as well. So that'll be really interesting to see what happens. Several state advocacy groups and national advocacy groups, including the HIV Center for Law and Policy, have submitted amicus briefs on behalf, so stay tuned. So all of these movements have one common denominator, and they are state civil advocacy group movements. And why are they so important? Well, as you can see, they've implemented a lot of change in 2 states at least already, and they're mobilizing in the majority of other states who have HIV-specific laws. And they also educate the public and professionals. As I was speaking to several national advocacy group leaders, they repeatedly told me that education is the key to changing these HIV-related statutes, because not only does the public need to understand the modern science behind HIV in relation to these HIV statutes, but so do the judges and the prosecutors, because as Tammy Hote said, there are just too many people who don't understand the law in relation to the science. And additionally, they mobilize support. And that's also extremely important when trying to get the backing of a legislature or a group leader on board to possibly change the laws or reform or repeal the laws or even challenge the constitutionality of a statute. So kind of shifting gears a bit, yeah, all of these state advocacy group movements and these legal, legislative changes and constitutionality challenges are great, but what about those who are already convicted and incarcerated? Throughout my research, I realized that really there's no specific post-conviction relief for HIV-related convictions. So, for example, we have the Release Aging Prison Population and Terminally Ill programs, also known as compassionate release programs. These are really ill-suited for HIV-related crimes because not only do they not fit the framework of HIV-specific statutes, but they also perpetuate the stigma that HIV is this deathly illness. By being released on a terminally ill program, it's just they're misaligned with one another. And then another huge issue is plea deals, which plea deals, as most of you are lawyers in here, but plea deals are basically pleading guilty in exchange for a less risky and sometimes less harsh sentence. So pros of plea deals, yeah, they're less risky, usually have a less harsh sentence associated with them, and no jury trial, which can be appealing to an individual who is facing a charge of HIV exposure, something that society generally doesn't look favorably upon in this day and age, unfortunately. Cons of plea deals, though, no jury trial. And a lot of the times, these plea deals are not included in HIV criminalization statistics. And in one recent report, it was approximated that approximately 95% of all criminal charges result in a plea deal. So we're only looking at 5% of the numbers if we apply that to HIV criminalization. And additionally, one of the most important issues when it comes to plea deals is that you waive your right to appeal. So in the United States versus Brady, the Supreme Court held that when you accept a plea deal, you are waiving certain constitutional rights, including that of an appeal. And so if you think about that, not only is that the end of the line for your trial or your conviction, but that's the end of the line for everything. You accept, that's just part of the bargain. You accept your conviction and your sentencing in return for, it being over, essentially, which can be a huge barrier for those trying to appeal their case based on a constitutionality issue, based on pretty much anything. And so if we go back to Batista's case in Ohio, that was something significant in his case in that he went to trial and was convicted and therefore had a right to appeal. And that's how they were able to appeal the constitutionality in that case. So where do we go from here? Like I said, education is key, and becoming involved in state advocacy groups is so important, and just getting the message out there that these statutes exist and they're stigmatizing and there is something to be done about them is probably one of the most important things that we can do. The second thing that we can look at is guidelines and frameworks from similar offense groups. So for example, nonviolent drug offenses are really seeing a real change here in the last 20 years. They're kind of along a similar timeline, I would say, as HIV offenses as well, in that they were born kind of out of this period of hysteria and unknown, and kind of this propaganda agenda that we need to lock up all of these drug offenders. But now, as we're facing the issues of mass incarceration, people are kind of taking a step back and saying, whoa, this might not be the best method to deal with these drug offenders. Maybe there are alternative methods. So for example, the Clemency Project 2014 created this framework in which nonviolent drug offenders, if they met certain thresholds and requirements of this framework, they could be released early and receive a shorter sentence. And that way, individuals who are convicted for 30 plus years of nonviolent drug offenses could possibly live a relatively normal life outside of prison. And it's important to note too that worked, and that law school clinics across the nation as well worked from that framework and guidelines, and it also worked for them as well. For example, the University of Tennessee College of Law Clinic used the same framework as Clemency Project 2014 and received significant results in that they got a majority of their clients released early from prison for a nonviolent drug offense. And so I think at this point, since there's no specific avenues for post-conviction relief for those convicted and incarcerated under HIV-related offenses, I think we can draw a lot of parallels from nonviolent drug offenses and seeking out these avenues and possibly coming up with a framework to mobilize and start talking at least about this issue of incarceration, because as I mentioned before, the numbers are skewed. We don't know how many individuals are incarcerated under these statutes, but they're probably a lot more than we even think. And then finally, from an international perspective, from the UN Arbitrary Detention Working Group, they recently visited the United States and evaluated the criminal justice system. And oh, sorry, I thought it was 5:45. And they recently evaluated the United States criminal justice system, and while they didn't look at HIV-specific related offenses, they did look at other aspects of our criminal justice system. And under my research, I concluded that likely HIV criminalization would violate 4 out of their 5 threshold requirements under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as well. And so that's an interesting perspective to take as well, because as a member state of the UN and as a model to other countries around the world, the United States has a role to act as a model and act as a role model, especially when it comes to their criminal justice system. So it's just an interesting point to think about and start talking about in order to implement these changes. And that is all I have for my presentation. And so I figured we could open it up to discussion and questions, and whatever comments anyone has.
So everyone has mics, so feel free to speak into the mic so that people can hear who are live streaming.
They're so fancy.
So I just had a question about question about the First Amendment claims in the Ohio suit. Were those because they were forced disclosures? The government was basically forcing the person to disclose that they had a condition. Was that the gist of the First Amendment claim, or was it something else?
I actually don't remember right now the basis for that First Amendment claim, but I will be sure to look that up for you. But I would assume it would have to do something such as like a forced disclosure of your HIV status or whatnot.
Or maybe sex as speech.
I'll look it up for you and I'll get back to you.
So I would also encourage anyone who's live streaming, I think they can hear me, that you can submit questions via Twitter, so at O'Neill Institute, and we'll be checking our Twitter page to make sure that we respond to your questions as well. And we would really love for this to, be a dialogue in kind of the remaining time that we have. So any, impressions that you guys have, or if you want to think about kind of opportunities, particularly for the law students in the room, to kind of get involved on these issues. I was really excited that Haley brought this to my attention to have this presentation, because I think there is a lot more that we can all do to kind of build to work with these broader kind of efforts. And I think there's a particular role that kind of law students, so working, here, either through the O'Neill Institute or through legal clinics, to kind of bring greater attention to these issues and also to educate. And I think in terms of that education piece, it's, I think, key to have law students and lawyers, because I mean, you guys probably are already aware that, we're a pretty insular little community, and lawyers, are more likely to listen to other lawyers than they are to, listen to like some doctor or researcher trying to tell us like how to kind of go about kind of doing our jobs. And so that kind of piece of kind of education, but education within our community, is, I think, really key.
I don't know if you have the answer to this, but I was wondering if throughout your research whether you were able to compare where HIV was being used as an aggravating factor, and maybe other sexually transmitted infections could have also been used in the same way, whether you've seen that as well. So things like herpes, you're having issues with antimicrobial resistance, syphilis, again, that, all of that would also fall into a similar category potentially for HIV. I don't know if you had any comparative statistics.
I don't have any specific statistics, but I will reiterate that these types of laws are pervasive kind of across STIs in general, and I have seen that an STI status being used as an aggravating factor in criminal sentencing for something like sexual assault or something like that. So that wouldn't necessarily be HIV isolated to HIV status. And I personally, I don't know the specific statistics, but I have seen that they're used in the same manner.
I think that's a really interesting question. I haven't done very much research on HIV criminalization, but at the O'Neill Institute, we're doing some work within our infectious disease initiative. A lot of the focus is on HIV, but the director of the initiative, Jeff Crowley, and then also my colleague sitting here, Sonia, does a lot of work on Hep C, and we're, obviously that's an epidemic that hasn't received as much attention in many cases as HIV, although it kills more people per year at this point in the U.S. Than HIV, and we're doing a lot. And we have a cure for it. We have medications to cure it, and I think a big push is to as one part of that is people need to be diagnosed and kind of know that they have hepatitis as they need to know with HIV or any other infectious disease. But that could become, as we're kind of pushing in that direction, knowing your status and then kind of how these laws start to kind of impact other infectious diseases is something to be thinking about. So even as we're pursuing efforts to kind of repeal or to reform like HIV specific statutes, and in some cases like to make them not focus specifically on HIV, but like on communicable disease, we need to make sure that we are kind of structuring the laws and kind of a lot of the ways that I think Haley's saying to make sure that in some cases, we probably just I don't think we probably should be thinking about these issues as as a criminal issue. We can probably have approaches to it that are purely public health and that don't invoke criminal law. But even if, to the degree that, we've seen successes in changing the laws in places like Colorado and Iowa, and there are, in some cases, remaining statutes that, address not just HIV, but other sexually transmitted infections and infectious diseases, we need to be, I think, very conscious of that. So.
And also, I think, too, as far as education goes, looking at these alternative methods instead of incarceration or convictions, looking at prevention and treatment. And I also think that's another component of education that really needs to be highlighted and emphasized as an alternative to the criminal justice system. I mean, is this really how we want to treat these sorts of issues in our society, by punishment versus preventative measures and treatment measures as well? So just kind of a side note.
I just want to really say thanks to Sean, the O'Neill Institute, for convening this discussion for World AIDS Day. Particularly, we know that criminalization is still such a barrier to getting people into testing, into care, adhering to treatment, reaching viral suppression. We just saw today the UN Secretary General's statement also highlighting these issues. In part for his final World AIDS Day statement. Also just want to thank Haley so much. It's been so great having her at UNAIDS. You see the kind of momentum that has been generated on this issue. And we're in this kind of wonderful predicament that it's so hard to keep up with the state-by-state advocacy. And even, as drafts were evolving, these kind of late-breaking moments of, hold on, critical update to add, new development. And I just, I guess my question really is, in light of this momentum and just kind of, these kind of positive developments in the pipeline, and just also considering just also the, tremendous institutional assets that a university like Georgetown has. You mentioned, the Tennessee experience, looking at Haley's research, also this gap that seems to be there for post-conviction relief. Are there, also interested here, also just, as students going through the program here, do you see opportunities where, as part of people's legal education, working in a kind of a clinical law setting, are there opportunities to join forces in ways that, maybe, working with civil society advocates, maybe going in some new directions going forward, building on some of this momentum, and perhaps addressing the situation of people who are currently incarcerated? Thanks.
If any student has a comment on that in terms of your own interest, I'd be interested to actually hear. We did invite a variety of the legal clinics to today's presentation, and I don't think we were. It's always a tough time of the year at the end of the semester to kind of get students and also, I guess, faculty of those clinics to attend. But
must be the rain
if there,
too.
and the weather as well, and the metro. There are lots of things that are working against us. But again, we're excited to host this conversation, but also to kind of continue thinking about what we can kind of do going forward. The O'Neill Institute is, obviously a resource for students and for anyone who's listening on the live stream. We're also, a resource for collaborating. We're doing a lot of work I mean, we do a lot of work globally, but we also do work nationally here in the U.S., and we're starting to do a lot more work focused on D.C., so collaborating with some of the institutions here, such as Whitman Walker and HIPS, which is one of the advocacy and kind of service providers for people who are engaged in sex work and or using or injecting drugs. So there's lots more for us to do, and one component of that, as Jason mentioned, could be amicus briefs and kind of working on cases in different ways. I mean, we're not a legal clinic, but if there's interest amongst students to kind of work on these types of issues, please, feel free to reach out to me and to, figure out what we can kind of do. I have interest in HIV, but also criminal justice in a broader sense, and I've started to develop some relationships even outside of DC. DC happens to be one of the states that doesn't have an HIV specific statute, nor has it had any convictions. I don't know if ever, but definitely not recently. But we're also at we're a tri-state region, and so we're looking at Maryland and Virginia, and there are, I'm sure, efforts that are going on there, and we can connect to and support those efforts through kind of legal, but then also kind of just strategy and other kind of advocacy. And so, please keep that in mind, and we'd love to kind of support any ideas that you guys have, and obviously be in touch.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you. Again, thank you guys all online as well, and feel free to send me any questions for those who are live streamed as well if you have any questions, and to tweet on Twitter. So,
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is wonderful.
Make this a reality.
Yes, this is great.
Yeah.
I wish I was staying here for next